At 71, Rick Warren just dropped a bombshell about Joel Osteen, and it's shaking the faith world to its core. After decades of navigating the highest circles of modern Christianity, Warren has broken his silence in a way no one saw coming, hinting at long-buried tensions and unspoken disagreements with one of America's most influential televangelists. What he chose to reveal, and what he's still leaving out, has both congregations and critics buzzing, and the ripple effects could redefine how millions see two of the faith realm's most powerful figures. At 71, Rick Warren didn't raise his voice, call anyone out by name, or stage a dramatic confrontation, and that's exactly why his words landed like an earthquake. In a space where messages are usually polished, softened, and carefully filtered, Warren chose something far more unsettling: quiet honesty. After decades of being seen as the steady, diplomatic force in evangelical leadership, he offered a reflection that felt less like a sermon and more like a confession. Listeners expected wisdom, maybe nostalgia. What they didn't expect was a moment that sounded like a line being crossed, not in anger, but in resolve. The kind of moment where you can almost hear a person deciding, in real time, that protecting harmony is no longer worth the cost of withholding truth. What made it even more striking was how long this silence had lasted. Rick Warren has shared platforms, audiences, and influence with Joel Osteen for years, often praised for his ability to unite very different styles of faith under one broad umbrella. He's never been impulsive, never reckless with words. So when he began speaking about the dangers of comfort-driven belief, about faith that avoids challenge in favor of applause, people immediately sensed this wasn't theoretical. This wasn't a general observation. It felt like something he'd been carrying, something that had finally grown too heavy to keep unspoken. There was no dramatic announcement, no headline-grabbing accusation. Just a carefully chosen set of words delivered with the calm of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. And in that calm was the real tension. Because Warren wasn't reacting to a scandal or responding to criticism, he was initiating something. A reframing. A subtle but unmistakable shift from cooperation to critique. In gossip terms, that's the most powerful kind of reveal. The one that doesn't shout, but forces everyone else to start whispering. Almost immediately, people began asking the same question. Why now? Why at 71, after a lifetime of influence, success, and carefully maintained relationships, would Rick Warren decide this was the moment to speak differently? The timing alone made the revelation feel intentional. This wasn't about building relevance or courting controversy. This was about legacy. About what gets said when you're no longer focused on being liked, but on being remembered accurately. And perhaps most compelling of all was what he didn't say. No direct mention of Joel Osteen. No explicit criticism. Just enough clarity to make the target obvious, and enough restraint to make it impossible to dismiss. That balance, between revelation and restraint, is what turned a few sentences into a full-blown media moment. Because when someone like Rick Warren finally lets the truth edge its way into public view, the story isn't just in the words themselves. It's in the years of silence that came before them, and the uncomfortable questions they leave behind. To understand why Rick Warren's words landed the way they did, you have to rewind and look at the long parallel paths that brought him and Joel Osteen to the same rarefied level of influence, and why those paths were never quite as aligned as they appeared. For years, the two men were grouped together in public conversations simply because of their scale. Massive churches, global audiences, best-selling books. But beneath that shared visibility were fundamentally different approaches to faith, leadership, and responsibility. Differences that many insiders noticed early on but few ever addressed directly. Rick Warren rose to prominence as a builder. His ministry was rooted in systems, structure, and long-term commitment. He spoke often about discipline, service, sacrifice, and the idea that faith should shape every aspect of a person's life, even when that process was uncomfortable. His message wasn't designed to be easy, it was designed to be enduring. Over time, that approach earned him respect as a thinker and strategist, someone other leaders quietly looked to for guidance behind the scenes. Joel Osteen's rise followed a very different rhythm. His message was lighter, more accessible, and intentionally focused on encouragement. He became known for sermons that uplifted rather than confronted, that emphasized possibility over correction. To millions, that tone felt refreshing, a faith that didn't feel heavy or demanding, but hopeful and affirming. His reach exploded, extending far beyond traditional church audiences into mainstream culture, television, and publishing at a scale few religious figures had ever achieved. For a long time, those differences were treated as complementary rather than conflicting. One offered depth. The other offered warmth. And publicly, there was little reason to suggest anything but mutual respect. They shared stages, appeared in overlapping circles, and were often presented as examples of modern Christianity's diversity rather than its division. But within leadership circles, the contrast was always more complicated. Some admired Osteen's reach but questioned the substance. Others respected Warren's rigor but wondered if it limited his appeal. These conversations existed, they just didn't happen where the public could hear them. That unspoken tension is what makes this moment feel so charged. Because when two figures spend years coexisting without openly addressing their differences, those differences don't disappear, they calcify. They become assumptions, quiet judgments, lingering concerns. And over time, they shape how leaders view not just each other, but the direction of the movement they represent. The longer those tensions remain unacknowledged, the more powerful it feels when someone finally gestures toward them. What's important here is that this isn't about a sudden disagreement or a recent incident. This is about two philosophies that have been moving in parallel for decades, occasionally intersecting but never truly merging. One prioritizes challenge as a path to growth. The other prioritizes comfort as a gateway to belief. Both have found massive audiences. Both have produced undeniable impact. But whether they can coexist without friction has always been an open question, one that Rick Warren's recent reflections have quietly dragged into the light. And that history is why listeners reacted so strongly. They weren't just hearing one man speak, they were hearing years of contrast finally being acknowledged. Because when icons share a history built on proximity rather than alignment, it only takes a few carefully chosen words to reveal just how much has been left unsaid. What made Rick Warren's remarks feel so powerful wasn't a shocking accusation or a headline-ready quote. It was the precision. Every word sounded intentional, as if he'd rehearsed the idea internally for years before finally allowing it to surface. He spoke about faith that stretches people instead of soothing them, about leadership that risks discomfort rather than chasing approval, and about the subtle danger of reshaping spiritual messages to fit what audiences want to hear. On the surface, it sounded reflective. But just beneath that surface was a current of critique that listeners immediately picked up on. Warren framed his thoughts as lessons learned over a lifetime, which made them harder to dismiss. He didn't position himself as an outsider throwing stones. He spoke as someone who understands influence intimately, how tempting it is, how fragile it can be, and how easily it can drift. He talked about the responsibility that comes with massive platforms, and how leaders must constantly ask whether they are forming people or merely affirming them. That distinction, delivered calmly and without theatrics, carried far more weight than any direct confrontation could have. To many, the message felt unmistakably pointed. When Warren spoke about faith that never asks anything of you, or messages that avoid repentance, sacrifice, or accountability, audiences immediately drew comparisons. Clips began circulating with captions suggesting this was the clearest line he'd ever drawn between substance and spectacle. Supporters argued he was finally articulating a concern that's existed quietly for years, that encouragement without challenge risks becoming entertainment rather than transformation. At the same time, Warren was careful enough to maintain plausible deniability. He never framed his comments as a correction of another leader. He spoke broadly, philosophically, almost pastorally. That restraint created a tension of its own. Because when someone as experienced as Rick Warren chooses implication over accusation, it signals confidence. He didn't need to explain himself further. He trusted that the audience would connect the dots on their own. That balance is what turned the moment into a lightning rod. Critics argued that if Warren had something specific to say, he should have said it directly. They accused him of creating division through implication rather than clarity. Supporters countered that his approach was exactly what made it effective, a mirror held up to modern faith culture rather than a personal attack. Either way, the conversation shifted. What had once been an abstract debate about styles of ministry suddenly felt personal, immediate, and unavoidable. Perhaps the most telling part of Warren's remarks was their tone. Not angry, not bitter, but resolved. There was no sense of rivalry or resentment, only a quiet insistence that truth matters more than comfort. And coming from someone who has spent decades prioritizing unity, that insistence felt like a line in the sand. Not drawn dramatically, but firmly. In gossip terms, this was the kind of reveal that doesn't explode all at once. It spreads. Slowly. Thoughtfully. It gives people just enough to debate, reinterpret, and speculate. And in doing so, it ensured that Warren's words wouldn't fade after a single news cycle. They lingered. They invited scrutiny. And they made one thing clear. This wasn't just reflection. It was a signal. It didn't take long for Rick Warren's words to escape their original context and take on a life of their own. Within hours, clips were circulating, quotes were being pulled apart line by line, and social media was doing what it does best, choosing sides before the dust had even settled. What started as a measured reflection quickly turned into a full-blown conversation, not just about Warren and Osteen, but about the future direction of modern faith itself. Supporters of Warren were among the loudest voices early on. Many praised him for what they saw as long-overdue honesty, arguing that he had finally articulated concerns that pastors and church leaders have whispered privately for years. To them, his comments felt like validation, proof that someone with nothing left to gain was willing to risk discomfort to protect what he believes faith is supposed to stand for. Posts framed him as a truth-teller, a veteran leader choosing integrity over popularity in the final chapters of his career. On the other side, criticism came just as fast. Some accused Warren of subtly undermining another leader without having the courage to address him directly. Others argued that his remarks fed unnecessary division, especially at a time when religious communities already feel fractured and defensive. There were accusations of elitism, of dismissing the value of encouragement in people's lives, and of ignoring the real-world impact Joel Osteen's message has had on millions who felt excluded or overwhelmed by more rigid expressions of faith. Joel Osteen's supporters mobilized quickly. They defended his approach as intentional, compassionate, and deeply effective. To them, hope-centered messaging wasn't a shortcut, it was the point. Commenters flooded platforms with personal testimonies, crediting Osteen's sermons with helping them survive loss, illness, and personal collapse. The implication was clear. Who gets to decide what depth looks like, and why should one style of faith be positioned as more legitimate than another? Meanwhile, commentators and media outlets added another layer to the reaction. Analysts dissected Warren's language, pointing out how carefully he had navigated the line between critique and commentary. Some called it masterful. Others called it calculated. Think pieces popped up asking whether this moment represented a broader shift among older evangelical leaders, a reckoning with the consequences of platform-driven faith in the age of algorithms and applause. And then there was the silence from Joel Osteen himself. No response. No clarification. No indirect reference in a sermon. That absence became part of the story almost immediately. Some interpreted it as restraint, a refusal to escalate a situation that didn't require a public rebuttal. Others saw it as strategic, allowing the conversation to burn itself out. But for many, the quiet only intensified curiosity. In a culture where responses are expected instantly, saying nothing can feel louder than saying everything. As reactions continued to stack up, one thing became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just about one man's comments. It had turned into a mirror reflecting deeper anxieties, about influence, authenticity, and what audiences are being taught to expect from spiritual leaders. And whether people sided with Warren, Osteen, or neither, the engagement itself revealed something powerful. A nerve had been touched. And once that happens, the conversation doesn't simply disappear, it evolves. Once the immediate reaction settled, a deeper question began to surface. Not about what Rick Warren said, but about what his words might quietly change. Because moments like this don't always create instant fallout. Sometimes they work more slowly, reshaping relationships, expectations, and power dynamics over time. And in this case, the implications stretch far beyond a single comment or a single leader. Rick Warren occupies a unique position. He isn't chasing relevance, building a brand, or expanding a platform. His influence is already cemented. That gives his words a different kind of authority, the kind that doesn't demand attention, but inevitably commands it. When someone at that stage subtly reframes what responsible leadership looks like, other leaders notice. Conference organizers notice. Publishers notice. Younger pastors, especially, pay attention to what is being affirmed and what is being questioned. There's also the issue of audience loyalty. For years, many followers comfortably admired both Warren and Osteen without feeling the need to choose between them. Their coexistence made it possible to enjoy different styles without confronting the tension between them. But moments like this disrupt that comfort. They force audiences to think more critically about what they value: challenge or reassurance, depth or accessibility, confrontation or comfort. And once people start thinking in those terms, allegiances can shift in subtle but meaningful ways. Behind the scenes, this kind of moment can influence invitations, collaborations, and endorsements. Leaders known for careful neutrality may feel pressure to clarify where they stand. Others may double down on their existing approach, seeing Warren's comments as either a warning or an overreach. Even silence becomes a choice, one that can be interpreted as agreement, disagreement, or strategic avoidance. For Joel Osteen, the implications are equally complex. His platform is enormous, his audience deeply loyal, and his message well-defined. This moment doesn't threaten that foundation, but it does challenge how it's perceived within leadership circles. Questions that were once whispered now feel safer to ask publicly, not necessarily as attacks, but as evaluations. And while Osteen may never address Warren's comments directly, the broader conversation they've sparked isn't something any influential figure can fully control. More broadly, this could mark a shift in how faith leaders talk about influence in the age of mass media. Algorithms reward positivity. Audiences reward affirmation. But Warren's words reintroduced an older question. What is lost when growth is sacrificed for comfort? That question doesn't have an easy answer, and that's exactly why it's powerful. It invites debate rather than closure. Whether this moment becomes a turning point or a footnote depends on what follows. Does Rick Warren continue speaking with this level of candor? Do others echo his concerns more openly? Or does the conversation gradually fade back into polite distance? What's clear is that something has already shifted. The illusion of seamless unity has cracked, revealing a more complicated reality beneath. And in a world shaped by influence, perception, and legacy, those cracks matter. Because they don't just expose disagreement, they invite a reckoning with what leadership really means when the applause eventually fades. And now, the story hangs in an uncomfortable kind of silence, the kind that makes people lean forward rather than move on. Rick Warren has said just enough to change the temperature of the room, but not enough to close the conversation. His words didn't end a debate, they opened one. And the most unsettling part is that no one knows whether this was a final reflection, or the first step in a much more candid chapter. Because when someone reaches a stage in life where reputation matters less than responsibility, restraint often loosens. Warren no longer needs to preserve alliances or smooth over differences for the sake of access. That reality alone has people wondering, was this a one-time moment of honesty or a signal that more unfiltered truths are coming? Those closest to his career know he's always been intentional. He doesn't speak casually, which makes the possibility of follow-up, whether direct or indirect, impossible to ignore. Then there's Joel Osteen's silence, which continues to fuel speculation. Silence can mean many things: confidence, dismissal, strategy, or preparation. Will he eventually respond with warmth, reframing the conversation around unity and shared purpose? Will he subtly counter the narrative through his messaging, without ever acknowledging Warren directly? Or will he continue saying nothing at all, letting the story exhaust itself while his audience remains firmly in place? Each option sends a message, and audiences are watching closely to interpret which one he chooses. What makes this moment linger is that it taps into something bigger than two men. It touches a nerve about influence, authenticity, and what audiences are being taught to expect from leaders in an age where comfort often outperforms challenge. That tension isn't going away. Even if the headlines fade, the question remains, and it's one that will quietly shape sermons, books, and platforms going forward. So the real cliffhanger isn't whether there's a response tomorrow or next week. It's whether this moment marks the beginning of a broader reckoning, one where more leaders feel emboldened to speak honestly about what's been left unsaid for years. Because if Rick Warren, at 71, has decided that truth outweighs harmony, others may soon follow. And if that happens, this won't be remembered as a passing comment or a fleeting controversy. It'll be remembered as the moment the tone shifted, when polite distance gave way to uncomfortable clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't explode loudly, but echoes quietly, long after everyone thought the conversation was over.